Good evening, everyone. I'm John Maass with the National Museum of the United States Army, coming to you from Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where the museum is located. And tonight we have our evening battle brief for September 2022 on the eve of the Yorktown campaign and surrender next month. Tonight's program is about the Yorktown campaign during the Revolution in 1781. Tonight, I will be talking about how the campaign developed in Virginia, starting with Washington's need for some kind of decisive campaign using French reinforcements and allies and naval assets that he was hoping to use that summer and fall in order to finally defeat the British. And also we're going to be following Lafayette and Cornwallis and their brief but very interesting campaign in central Virginia. A little bit of background here on where this campaign started. And this really was a huge, sprawling campaign that was all over the American coast and on down into the West Indies. There were the naval forces of the French and the British. There were the armies on land of the British, the Americans, the French, militia forces. It was really a large-scale campaign that all came together in what still is a small town on the York River in Virginia in 1781. But the background for it is really that Washington, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, who was in New York, wanted to be able to have this campaign go against New York. That was his goal. And he knew he would be able to do some kind of grand scale campaign or operation with French naval power. Once the French allied with the US in 1778, all of a sudden the Americans had an ally with naval power. And the question was how to harness or coordinate the French naval power in America, in France, in the Caribbean, the West Indies, bring as many naval assets and armies and infantry forces together at one spot to concentrate their efforts against a British important base or stronghold. So the naval power of the French was very important because the Americans did not have a significant navy. And in order to really bottle up the British or force a coastal garrison to surrender, there really needed to be some kind of naval force of the French to coordinate with a landside attack. And Rochambeau, who was the French commander of the land forces, was in Rhode Island because the French had a large base at Newport, Rhode Island. And Washington and Rochambeau continually wrote back and forth. They met a few times, most notably in Connecticut in the late winter, early spring, to try to coordinate just such a movement. And the Americans and Rochambeau knew that at some point the French were planning to send over army reinforcements, but also a significant number of ships to augment the French Navy that was already in American waters. So the Washington also knew, and the French, who were too polite really to point this out to Washington, but certainly knew among themselves and the French government, knew that the Americans were in really poor condition, that their recruiting was low, their uniforms needed replacement, they were short on arms and equipment, they needed money to pay the soldiers, and morale was low. And it didn't take a genius to be able to figure out that in in the winter and early spring of 1781 that the coming campaign really needed to be the final massive blow that Washington and the French had hoped to coordinate over the last 3 years. This had to be it. And again, the question was to attack the main British base at New York, which is what Washington favored, where the American commander-in-chief of the British forces, Sir Henry Clinton, was based out of, or a campaign against the British base and their forces operating in the Chesapeake to be able to bottle up any British naval ships and forces there, in addition to whatever land forces that were operating there. And that's what the French preferred, was that latter one. And this operation, from Washington's perspective and Rochambeau's perspective up in New York and New England, really gained traction when it was learned that Admiral de Grasse was coming to the Chesapeake from the West Indies. And he would have a significant number of ships, which we'll talk about toward the end of the presentation, to combine with the French Navy, the Navy squadron in Rhode Island, and to attack some point. So it looked very promising by the early part of 1781, at least by about April or so, that this would be able to transpire in some way. So next slide, please. So before the operations at Yorktown, there was, as you may know, a sprawling campaign within Virginia that went basically from Petersburg to Fredericksburg and Culpeper, and from Charlottesville all the way down to Portsmouth. And within that time period of April, May, June, and July, and a little bit of August, there was quite a bit of campaigning, although there was really only one skirmish, and I'll call it a small battle that made up this campaign. And those of you who tuned in to our previous program last year on Tarleton's Charlottesville raid of 1781 got a lot of the details. And so I'm going to go over that broadly here, the part about the Charlottesville raid and the background, but I'll give you enough so that you all will understand the movements and directions of the British and the Americans, and then later the French, prior to the beginning of the siege of Yorktown in September of 1781. So we might say that things began when Cornwallis won the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina on March 15th, 1781, which coincidentally was another one of our battle briefs last year. In that battle, Lord Cornwallis, the British commander in the South, defeated the American commander in the South, Major General Nathaniel Greene, and he won the battle. It was a Pyrrhic victory. Greene was able to get most of his troops off the field in good order. The British suffered numerous casualties and were forced to withdraw to the coastal North Carolina port town of Wilmington, which they reached by the end of April. Once resupplied down there, the British, under Cornwallis, decided to move into Virginia in late April. And there Cornwallis wrote to his superior, with whom he had been in very poor communications for the last 3 or 4 months, that until Virginia is subdued, the South will always have a logistical basis to keep fighting the war. So his goal was to move into Virginia to destroy the American logistical tail, which is what we would say today in modern parlance. But the ability of to wage war, raise troops, get supplies, get food, send it down to the Carolinas. That's what he wanted to destroy. Now, Washington decided, because of previous British raids that winter and spring in the Chesapeake and along the James River, to send a force to bolster Virginia's defense, and also work in conjunction with Nathaniel Greene, who, after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, would soon move his troops into South Carolina. So Cornwallis sent a contingent of light infantry from the Army's camps along the Hudson River, north of New York City, close to West Point, under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, a young man who was 14 years younger than Washington, a French officer, but was serving in America as a major general with an American Continental Commission. And to really gloss over things, both forces met in the Richmond area by the end of April, and Cornwallis by May 15th. Cornwallis moved up to the Richmond area in May, in Petersburg. The previous British commander of troops in the Richmond, Tidewater, Virginia area, Major General Phillips, had died of a fever about a week or so before the British arrived, May 20th, 1781. So by 1781, you had Cornwallis and several thousand British troops in Petersburg, and you had Lafayette with about 1,100 light infantry, artillerymen, a handful of dragoons on the north bank of the James River in the Richmond area. And that began what became known as the Piedmont Campaign. And again, Cornwallis's objective was to move around the interior of the state and destroy tobacco and military supplies, any arms and equipment, disrupt any troops being raised, and also to disperse Virginia militia forces. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I've superimposed some directions and locations and troop positions on a 1760s map, 1750s map of Virginia. And you can see Cornwallis at the bottom there, at Petersburg, where the yellow circle is, Richmond up at the top with the yellow circle. Cornwallis decided to move east and crossed the James River at Westover Plantation and moved directly north to put pressure on Lafayette, but also to begin to attack and assault these positions near Richmond and central Virginia, including Fredericksburg, and destroy them. So here you can see Lafayette moving off to the north on the map. Cornwallis was chasing him. He went by the way of Malvern Hill, which is the same Malvern Hill that's where the Revolutionary War battlefield is. Strike that, Civil War battlefield is, up toward Hanover Courthouse. And so let's check out the next slide. And this was really the central area where the campaign lasted from roughly early or late May through about June 16th or 17th, when Cornwallis got back to Richmond. So he first went to Cook's Ford, which you can see on your map. That is on the North Anna River, not too far from Ashland and Hanover Courthouse. Lafayette was very careful to avoid him during this period because Cornwallis outnumbered him, even after Cornwallis at Westover had sent back hundreds and hundreds of his troops to garrison Portsmouth, Virginia. So he was always, Lafayette always tried to put a water barrier, meaning a creek, a river, a swamp, between him and Cornwallis, because Cornwallis's men were very experienced in quick marches. They had a hard-hitting cavalry unit under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, whose picture you can see in the bottom right. So while Cornwallis was at Cook's Ford with the entire army, he decided to move to destroy a large American supply depot and arms repair location, which you can see on the left side of your map on the river, called Point of Fork. And Cornwallis was going to move directly there, but while he was doing so, he decided to send a mounted raid under Tarleton with his dragoons and some infantry, and that became known as Tarleton's Charlottesville Raid, June 3rd and 4th, 1781. We had that program last year, and one of the objectives, though, was that Cornwallis had gotten information that the Virginia legislature was meeting at Charlottesville, and Thomas Jefferson was in residence in Charlottesville, and he was the soon-to-be retired governor of Virginia. So part of Tarleton's mission was to disturb the assembly, as Cornwallis wrote, and capture Jefferson. But you can see his main objective was at the Point of Fork. So he made a large circuit from Cook's Ford toward Point of Fork and then back down to Richmond by June 17th. So next map, please. This shows you Lafayette, his movements, and Tarleton's. Lafayette retreated from Richmond, kept going farther and farther north. He crossed the Newfound River, he crossed the South Anna River, crossed the North Anna River, and here you see at the top right of that map, he crossed the Rapidan River at Ely's Ford. And those of you who are interested in the Civil War, that is located several miles directly north of the Chancellorsville Battlefield Visitor Center. It's right in that area. So this shows Tarleton's route also. He was coming from Cook's Ford, came through Hanover County, Louisa County, eventually reached Boswell's Tavern, which is on the map. And if you look over to the right, the top building is Boswell's Tavern. It was built in as early, or at least as early as 1752. It was a tavern at a crossroads. It's still standing, and it's just off US 15 in the far corner of Louisa County, just off the road. So it's privately owned, but you can drive by and see it very easily. And that was a spot there that's still around today. Tarleton did raid Charlottesville. Jefferson managed to escape. Several legislators were captured, including Daniel Boone. Tarleton did minimal damage there and retired eventually to Point of Fork and back to Goochland Courthouse to meet the main force under Cornwallis. Lafayette was very wary of Cornwallis at this point, but on June 10th, between, north of Boswell's Tavern, close to what's now Orange Courthouse in Orange County, Virginia, he was joined by about 1,000 additional Continentals from the Pennsylvania line under Brigadier General Anthony Wayne. So that doubled the size of Lafayette's Continentals. He was getting more reinforcements from the western part of Virginia, the riflemen from Southwest Virginia, and the southern end of the Shenandoah Valley. And so Lafayette tailed Cornwallis, but really was too weak to attack his rear guard. But Cornwallis and Tarleton both headed east back to Richmond by the middle of June and reached there by the 16th. And of course, that's Monticello down below. A detachment of Tarleton's cavalry did make it up to the mountain and tried to find Tarleton. They were unable to capture him. He had departed just really less than an hour beforehand and fled the area. So next screen, please. Okay, so let's take up our story here at Richmond. You can see with the star up above and Petersburg down below, just to give you some reference. So Cornwallis moved in June, starting around the 17th of June, out of Richmond to Bottoms Bridge, which you can see I have the two vertical lines there at Bottoms Bridge. That is currently where US 60 Williamsburg Road crosses the Chickahominy River in eastern Henrico into James City County and New Kent County. So he went to New Kent Courthouse, all the while followed at a respectful distance by Lafayette to New Kent Courthouse, which I've marked on the map, and then into a southeasterly march to Williamsburg, which is in the bottom right corner with a circle, a yellow circle. And Lafayette took up a position about a dozen miles or so from Williamsburg. We'll get a little bit more detail in a second. And the two red stars there that you see at the bottom, those are the locations of the skirmish and the small battle that we'll get into in a second, which will be most of the focus of the rest of the program. The one on the top is Spencer's Ordinary, and the one on the bottom is Green Spring. And just for your reference, I would also point out that I have an X at the bottom of the map. That is where Cornwallis was going to cross the James River from where Jamestown National Historic Site is, and Virginia's Jamestown Historical Park, ferried over the James to the south side of the river at a place called Cobham, and that is no longer in existence anymore. But eventually Cornwallis wanted to move to Portsmouth to begin looking for a port where Sir Henry Clinton had advised him to try to find some place the British could use as a deep water port for their ocean-going navy, and where Cornwallis's troops could wind up. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so there were two engagements, let's call them here. The first one at Spencer's Ordinary up at the top, and you can see the two opposing forces there. And the second one being at the bottom of the map at Green Spring, the Battle of Green Spring. And the other locations I've marked as Williamsburg. You can see the yellow circle near the W, but also the Green Spring Plantation. The Battle of Green Spring takes its name from a 17th century plantation owned by the governor at the time, Sir William Berkeley, who was the royal governor and was the governor at the time of the famous Bacon's Rebellion in 1675, 1676. And his plantation was still standing, actually, by the time of the Revolution. There's one watercolor by Benjamin Latrobe that shows it. There's very little there today. I have a picture of it to show you all. But Lafayette had moved down from his position in New Kent to the northwest and had moved ever closer toward Williamsburg. And we'll see a little bit more detail of the battlefield in a second. Simcoe, who was Lieutenant Colonel Simcoe of the Loyalist unit called the Queen's Rangers. It was a mounted unit that also was part infantry and dragoons. So he moved his unit, the Queen's Rangers, and some additional units out toward Spencer's Ordinary and Chickahominy Church, which is where that X is, just below the French word Lay and under LE. That's where the battle happened at Spencer's Ordinary there. It's about 6 miles from Williamsburg, and he was actually out on an expedition to try to get some food. And so he brought horses and infantrymen, and he was on an expedition there, and also had one piece of artillery in case he got into trouble. So they knew that the Americans were nearby, but Cornwallis had ordered Simcoe to scout in that area. And Spencer's Ordinary is very close to Chickahominy Church, and I'll show you that shortly. And then down below, we'll have more detail, but Spencer's Ordinary was fought on the 26th of June, and Greenspring was fought on the 6th of July, so about a little less than 2 weeks apart. And that battle was down again near Jamestown Island, and where Virginia's Jamestown Settlement Museum and Historic Site are located, to give you a little idea of where we are here. Okay, next slide, please. So Spencer's Ordinary was what we would normally call a skirmish in the South, because the battles tend to be a little bit smaller, other than Charlestown in 1780 and of course Yorktown in 1781. But it really was a small engagement made between an American detachment led by Colonel Richard Butler, who had cavalry and infantry with him. Lafayette had gotten wind of Simcoe's, John Graves Simcoe's detachment of the Queen's Rangers, and decided, well, I'm not strong enough to really attack Cornwallis's main body, but let's try to attack and pick off one of his detachments. So he had gotten good intelligence on that. Simcoe had moved to the Spencer's Ordinary area and was starting to forage west of there when Lafayette sent this detachment by Butler to strike them. So the Simcoe was attacked or saw the Americans approaching, and he also had a field gun with him, and the gun in this area was placed on the road, and I'll show you that on a map in a minute, because a lot of this land was overgrown and old tobacco fields, woods. It wasn't ideal for cavalry or artillery, but they did have a piece of artillery with them, or at least one. So Simcoe attacked Butler's troops, and it's a very confusing battle. There are actually two different maps. They're both based on the same one map. One is in German, one is in English. But the gist of it was that the Americans decided to withdraw after Simcoe eventually attacked them and tried to flank them with his Hessians on the right side of the battlefield, the British right. And they withdrew to a position beyond Chickahominy Church called Tyree's Plantation. Simcoe moved back to Williamsburg, but at the beginning of this engagement, near this crossroads at Spencer's Tavern or Spencer's Ordinary, Simcoe realized that he was in enough trouble with the Americans approaching him that he sent a courier back to Williamsburg to alert Cornwallis, who began moving with most, if not all, of the British army toward the crossroads at Spencer's, but didn't reach there until this skirmish was over. So let's go to the next slide if we could. So this is a map. It's a little blurry because I took it off some signage down there. The original I did not have access to. I have since actually gotten access to it, but when I made these slides, I did not. But we'll have another map in a second here, but that shows it a little bit better. If you look at the map, the Americans were coming down from the north, having been at Chickahominy Church to the north, to the west northwest, and they moved down the road there, which was the road that would eventually either fork to Williamsburg or fork toward the James River. And you can see the map shows some hilly country It's very difficult to discern the battlefield out there today. On one hand, it's very good that a lot of the battlefield to the west of the road, to the left of the road here, this map, has been preserved in that it's part of Jamestown, Freedom Park, a county park in James City County. So you can walk over most of this, but it's thoroughly wooded, and these small rises here that you see are very difficult to find out there on the terrain. And so we really wouldn't do much to have a picture of thick woods, but this is the layout of the battle. The crossroads is down there on the bottom of the map, where you see the Williamsburg Road coming in from the right. And don't worry, I'll have a better map in a second. But that's where the British started from, and Simcoe advanced against the Butler's forces and eventually pushed them up and really forced them to retire back up toward Chickahominy Church. The casualties were pretty low, and Simcoe wound up moving away from this location to our right on the map on that Williamsburg Road, which is horizontal. You can see at the bottom right of our map. So let's go, and that's an intersection. That is the image on your left is the church site. It's at a crossroads now. There's a church on there called Chickahominy Church, but there's no real remnants of anything 18th century there anymore. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. So this is really the only kind of open area at Spencer's Ordinary you can see. And this view, if you look on the map, I've put an X on the left-hand side of the map where it says guns. And that's where I was standing when I took the photo on the left, looking down the Williamsburg Road. So if you go to the picture, the road in the foreground leads into the park. That was not there at the time. But the road that goes left, right, and the other road that goes off into the distance, that's the Williamsburg Road, that's all part of the battlefield. And the Ordinary itself, it was about a half a mile or less down the Williamsburg Road on the left-hand side. So there's an historical marker there. It used to be up on Route 60, and after I advised the Virginia Division of Historic Resources that they had the date wrong on the sign, they changed the date and moved it to a more appropriate location. And you can see there are two markers there on the left, but that's what it looks like today. And you can get a little bit more, this is the German map here, you can get a little bit more idea of the advance. Simcoe's attack on the right toward the Americans and kind of forced them to retreat. Okay, so let's move on to Green Spring. What you see here is Green Spring Plantation. So the battle was not fought in the area where the house was. And you can see there's a map on the left that shows the house on the right-hand side of the road. That's the main road that's still there today that leads from the battlefield area up toward Spencer's Ordinary and Williamsburg. The Green Spring House, you can see there were gardens there. It was a laid out plan. And this is a picture of the open field that is there. It's on both sides of the road. The Park Service owns this property and occasionally has programming there, or did before the pandemic. And but there's no 18th century building standing there at all. But that's where Lafayette's troops would have passed and did pass as they headed from north to south on that map right there. All right, next slide, please. Okay, the Battle of Green Spring was on July 6, 1781. And in a nutshell, what happened was Cornwallis decided to basically get out of Williamsburg. And he wanted to move to Portsmouth. And the easiest way to do that was by moving across the James River and in to the south side, and then move east toward Portsmouth. And in order to do that, he had to cross the river, which he decided to do at a narrow spot on the James River, right near Jamestown Island, which we know today as the original settlement of 1607, what have you. But he decided, when he realized that Lafayette was getting closer and closer to him, and he decided to play a trick on Lafayette and induce Lafayette to attack him by fooling the Americans into thinking that only the rear guard of the British force was on the north side of the river and the rest of the army had passed across. Well, in reality, he only sent across the wagons, Simcoe's Queen's Rangers, and some loyalist militia units, but the rest of the army was arrayed in battle formation on the bottom right of this map, you see. There's an image of the British camp, and I drew an arrow to where that is today. And then there was the church there. The ruins are there. You can see the ruins of the church. It's called Church on the Main because it was on the main road from the Jamestown area to Williamsburg. And that church, the site is there of the church, and there's some kind of redone ruins and some markers. It's a nice little place to see. But the British decided that they were going to ambush and fool and then spring a trap on Lafayette when he advanced too far. The arrow on the top left of the map shows the way to Greenspring, and the American force under General Anthony Wayne came down the road from off the map, down from that corner toward the British camp, and they planned to attack the British. They also had artillery with them and various other units, and it turns out that they were approaching over somewhat of a causeway with swampier ground on the left and the right. They were approaching an ambush by a much, much greater British force. So let's go one more slide. So we'll just go through this very quickly for the kind of the facts and figures. The Americans, Lafayette was at Chickahominy Church and decides to advance an element, a detachment led by Wayne of 500 men, which was later reinforced to 800 men. So as he was approaching, Lafayette was near him. As he was approaching the position, Lafayette began to grow suspicious that there were more British troops, or potentially more British troops, in the area than it looked like. And he did a personal reconnaissance at some point to the American right over on the James River, and at whatever point that was, which I don't believe has really ever been established, he saw that the British had more men and quickly rode back to try to warn Wayne of this threat. Well, the British charged Wayne with their troops in a bayonet charge. Wayne saw it was a very powerful force coming at him unexpectedly. And while Lafayette tried to reinforce him, Wayne decided that the best defense at this point was a good offense. And he had his small force charge the British with bayonets and cannon fire, which threw them off somewhat, stunned them a little bit, and then Wayne withdrew while Lafayette was bringing up the rest of the main force to bail out Wayne if he had to. So it was a very sharp clash. There are a number of accounts, first-person accounts of this battle that testify to the heavy firing, the duration of the firing. The Americans charging with bayonets and getting in close with the British. Eventually, the British were trying to work their way around the American left by way of the Church of the Main I showed you, and that was also a potential threat, but eventually the Americans withdrew. They did have to leave their two artillery pieces behind because most, if not all, of the American artillery horses had been shot down, killed or wounded. And Lafayette, too, lost a horse at the time. He was thrown down from his horse, as was one of his French officer aides as well. So let's go to the next slide and see a little bit more of the battle. This is the battlefield as it looks today. This is the land is owned both privately and publicly. It has not been turned into a battlefield park. There is signage out there to interpret part of where the troops' location were. The troops were located. On the left is an image of the American view looking towards the woods. That's where the British had lined up their infantry on both sides of the road and hid a lot of their forces so that they were unseen. But back on the left side of the road, also well into the trees there, stretching out off this image to the left, it was the British position. The view on the right was positioned from the advancing British lines. The Americans were mostly located in that cornfield off to the left of the road. And this is the road you see that went from the Jamestown area and the ferry that Cornwallis was using out toward Green Spring Plantation. Now, at the time, these were not cornfields, and actually these images were taken in early August, and the corn had been planted. It's a little easier to get a feeling for the battlefield when the ground is not planted in corn, late fall through early spring. So if you do go out there to look around, I would advise, if you want to try to get a little bit better feel for the distances and the terrain, you might want to go during those times. Okay, next slide. So this is the battlefield of Green Spring. You see Cornwallis's position on the bottom right hand of the screen. Off the screen to the southeast would be the ferry and Jamestown, and where the British camped. The British had a flanking maneuver past the church, which you can see on the right-hand side of the map. I've marked that. And that flanking movement, I pointed out with an arrow. There are two red boxes up there. That's from the original map. Map was done in 1781. And then the main attack that the British made was directly forward from the position where it says E to G. And the Americans had advanced from the top left of the map toward the British along the road, and then had deployed to the southwest of the road in a farm area, and that's where most of this this fighting took place. Okay, let's move to we got a couple more slides. Let's move to the next one. This is another map that you can see with a picture of the American line on the right. This is the part of the map. This is part of the signage out at Green Spring, at the battlefield itself on the Green Spring Road. Again, the Jamestown Park is to the bottom right. And this shows you the troop movements, the flanking movement of the British on the right that went by and close to the church, and the advance, and then the attack and then retreat of the Americans after they had made their advance. They withdrew. Where it says "you are here," you see the arrow there on the road. There's a pull in there with some signage, and that's where this sign is located. So there is, if you're interested in going out there, there are some waysides and a few markers. So it's worth going out there. Okay, next slide. All right, this is an image of a piece of horse furniture that was found on the Battle of Green Spring battlefield within the last 8 or 9 years. And it is a French fleur de lis. Um, it is most likely from either Lafayette's horse or the horse of his aide. Well, several of the French officers' horses were shot and were disabled on the battlefield. And this was dug up by archaeology in what was behind the American lines. It's quite possible it's where Lafayette and his aide were when they had been fired upon. So just a little bit of a artifact there for us to look at. Next slide, please. All right, so on the right-hand side, strike that. On the left-hand side of your map, you can see the yellow and red explosion there. That was the Green Spring battlefield. Where it says Green Spring with a circle, that's where the house was that I showed you the site of. Williamsburg just above them to the right. And the British crossed from Jamestown to Cobham, which you see on the lower bank of the James River. And from there, they moved to Suffolk, which is in the middle of the map on the lower edge. And from there, again, down to Portsmouth, which is where they already had a position for several years. There were earthworks and fortifications and troops, and fairly large size ships could go up the Elizabeth River and get in there and resupply them. And of course, Yorktown is at the top. That's where Cornwallis eventually wound up. You can see a picture of the crossing site at the James River. It's pretty wide in there, but it is fairly narrow where the ferry went from Jamestown over to Cobham to cross the main army and eventually get to Portsmouth. So next slide, please. This shows another map of the route, the British route from Jamestown down to Portsmouth, which I'm hoping it's not cut off on your image there. It's down the bottom right of the map where the yellow circle is located. They wound up crossing the James River and exploring several other posts to see if they would fit the bill for a port and garrison, and eventually decided that Yorktown was the place. All right, let's finish up with the next slide. I'm sorry, we got one more after this. This shows in detail from a map done by French engineers, the Jamestown crossing from across the James, and then eventually the location you can see of Yorktown and Gloucester. That's where the British wound up before the siege. All right, next. All right, we're not going to read all this because we're kind of running close to time. But in a nutshell, and Dr. McCarley next time is going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. The French were able to concentrate two different squadrons, one under de Barras and the other under de Grasse, and at possibly the most important naval engagement, I'm sure, in fact, I would venture to say it is the most important naval engagement of the Revolutionary War, was the Battle of the Capes, fought between Cape Henry and Cape Charles at the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay against a smaller British force under Admiral Graves. The French won the victory, which eventually sealed in Cornwallis into his position, but I don't want to steal any of Dr. McCarley's thunder for next week, but while all this other campaigning was going on, the big picture was Washington and Rochambeau moved their troops by land and water from Rhode Island across Connecticut, meeting the Americans in the Hudson Highlands of New York, and eventually down to the Yorktown area. by the end of September. So with that, I am going to leave off on the story, and my good friend Britt McCarley is going to talk about that next week. But let's go ahead. We've got a few questions in the Q&A here. One of them is a long-term friend and author of mine, Jenny Cody, who reminds us, happy birthday to Lafayette. So thank you, Jenny, for reminding us of those. Another question here, what were the casualties at each battle? The Spencer's ordinary casualties were very light, 20 or 30 on each side. Green Spring more so. I don't have the details handy, however, I will get those, and Dr. McCarley will be able to give those to you at the program next Tuesday if you can join us for that. Otherwise, contact me via email, and I'd be happy to do that. The Americans lost 100 or so men. The British roughly the same. I know that's very vague and what have you, but not really bloody battles. Although the fighting at Green Spring among the Continentals and the British regulars got to be very heated and within 100 yards. So it was pretty intense there. So that wraps up the campaigning here. The campaign really in Virginia, and Britt will mention this too, I think. One of the interesting parts of it for those people who like to get out and tour these spots is that obviously there's the National Park and the Virginia State location at Yorktown, but many of these sites are available. The Washington Rochambeau route is clearly marked, and with some help and some digging, you can find the routes of the British and the Americans, Cornwallis versus Lafayette, and get out there at Green Spring and get out there at Spencer's Ordinary too. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all. Welcome to the National Museum of the United States Army Battle Brief. Today we're going to be talking about the second part of the Yorktown campaign with Dr. Britt McCarley. Dr. McCarley is the Chief Historian for the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. He has led staff rides to Yorktown for many, many years and is currently working on one of the publications in the series for the Army's series on the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. And those individual publications will be out before then, of course, but Dr. McCarley also received a PhD in history from Temple University. So Britt, again, welcome to you. We're glad you're here.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to present this afternoon. I'm going to take the story of the 1781 Virginia campaign from the point where John left off last week after the Battle of Green Spring and take us all the way through the surrender of the British, German, and Loyalist army under Cornwallis at Yorktown at a place called Surrender Field on the 19th of October, 1781. So let's jump right into those details because there are lots of them. Okay, on this slide, I'm going to pause for a moment and let you read through the agenda that I will try to accomplish this afternoon, basically taking us from the Anglo-German movement to Yorktown, all the way through a consideration of the geography and the details of the siege itself, and then the process of capitulation at the end, and then make a few comments, very brief comments at the end about what all of this meant and what all of it caused. So I'll pause for a moment here as well and mention that all of the maps that you see in this presentation in this style come from the Army University Press staff ride team at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, a very fine group of people with whom I've worked for many years. and they do excellent work, including producing excellent maps, and all of the maps in this style that staff ride team produced. This one summarizes most of what John covered last week, which is to say Cornwallis's arrival in Virginia in the third week of May 1781, and then his campaign up into the Piedmont. John called it the Piedmont campaign last week, as far west as Charlottesville, and then his turn back toward the coast about the beginning to the middle of June. This map covers the rest of what John surveyed for us last week. And down in the lower right-hand corner, you can see, I hope you can see my cursor moving around. You can see the convergence of a lot of blue and red lines and arrows in the Williamsburg area. That's covering the events that John mentioned last week, the Battle of Spencer's Ordinary and the Battle of Green Spring. That's where John left us off, and that's where I will pick things up. After the Battle of Green Spring, the British Army crossed over the James River back to Southside, as we call it in Virginia, and headed in two directions at once. The bulk of the army headed east to Portsmouth, the British base of operations on the Elizabeth River, while the mounted unit, the British Legion under Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, headed west, eventually as far west as as New London in Bedford County, to continued depredations against the American ability to supply operations in the Carolinas. Made about a 400-mile round trip, really succeeded in not much more than wearing out a bunch of horses. And in the process of these movements from the peninsula between the York and James rivers, as Virginians call it, to Southside and on to Portsmouth, Cornwallis and the British commander in North America, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, engaged in an extended and often difficult correspondence. And Cornwallis received along the way, on the 26th of June, the same day as the Battle of Spencer's Ordinary, a letter that I will read a small portion of, because this letter changed things for how the British were operating in Virginia. Cornwallis again received this on the 26th of June, letter written on the 15th of June. Clinton begins, "My Lord, I beg leave to recommend it to you as soon as you have finished the active operations you may now be engaged in, to take a defensive station in any healthy situation you choose, be it at Williamsburg or Yorktown. And I would wish in that case that, after reserving to yourself such troops as you may judge necessary for an ample defense and desultory movements, meaning harassing movements, by water for the purpose of annoying the enemy's communications, destroying magazines, etc., the following corps may be sent me in succession as you can spare them." And then he goes on to list about 3,000 units that composed about 3,000 of Cornwallis's troops that were to be sent back up to New York to contribute to the British defense of New York City against the combined efforts of the French and the Americans. And I'll come back around to that point a little later on. That letter changed things because in the following correspondence, Clinton eventually rescinded the order, but continued the direction for Cornwallis to find a deep water port somewhere in the Tidewater region of Virginia and to stay there until further directed, resupplied in place, reinforced in place, or removed or evacuated and taken up to New York for the defense of that city. So that letter begins a sequence of events that takes us all the way eventually to Surrender Field. Let's take a brief look at the organization of the British Army as it made its way to Yorktown, all under the command of Lieutenant General Cornwallis, and numbering here, as you see, around 7,500. That's probably a bit low. The sources vary, as they always will, as to numbers, and the British, German, and Loyalist army may have come closer, much closer to 10,000. Eventually, the Franco-Americans would oppose them at Yorktown with about 20,000 men under arms. So Cornwallis, once we get to the siege, would be outnumbered by about 2 to 1. And another element that I'll develop further as we go along was the presence of the French Navy, which brought about 30,000 French sailors to Tidewater, Virginia. So at the tactical level, as we say, Cornwallis eventually would be outnumbered 2-1. At the operational level or at the campaign level, he would eventually be outnumbered decisively at 5-1. But taking a look here at the organization of the British Army, it's a combined arms force composed of artillery, a couple of mounted units under Simcoe and Tarleton. John mentioned those last week. They were both loyalist units, and then a trio of British infantry brigades, and then a couple of German auxiliary infantry units, usually at the battalion or regimental level. The British Army began arriving at Yorktown on the 1st and 2nd of August, 1781, and began to dig in on both sides of the river. On the Gloucester Point side, which I'll mention in just a moment, and on the Yorktown side on the south bank. These are several views of Yorktown. The town as we know it today dates from the early 1690s. And focus your attention on the illustration at the top left of the slide. That's a painting that shows that the town sits atop bluffs about 30 to 40 feet above mean high tide. And you can see across the river to a little point of land over there. That's a half-mile distance across the river. The river narrows there to half a mile. And on the north bank is Gloucester Point. The British were digging in over there as well, but slowly. They arrived in August. If you've ever been in this part of Virginia in August and September, especially in August, it's very hot and humid. And the British were still digging in at the end of the first week of October when the siege proper began. So their effort to prepare for a siege, which they certainly did not anticipate in August, was slow indeed. This slide shows you a little better the actual fortifications that the British dug around Yorktown. You see the heavy line of fortifications around the town itself. That's the inner defense line. On the left and right flanks of which there were outworks or redoubts. We'll focus most of our attention, if you can see my cursor again, on redoubts 9 and 10, covering the left flank of the British inner defense line. And also take a look at this line here, again, following my cursor of redoubts out in the countryside, about half a mile or so outside of Yorktown itself, in an area called Pigeon Quarter or Pigeon Hill, between the headwaters of two creeks, Wormley Creek to the south and Yorktown Creek to the west. After the Second Battle of the Capes, which I'll come to in a few minutes, Cornwallis directed the construction of this line of redoubts to cover the avenues of approach overland from the Williamsburg area, or anywhere else for that matter, to Yorktown itself. Cornwallis, I think, began to figure that as a result of the Second Battle of the Capes, by which the British lost control of the sea, again, we'll come to those details shortly, that he might be opposed by some combination of French and American forces. And so he began to dig these, construct these redoubts to watch those avenues of approach. The British did not dig in heavily with the intent to withstand a siege. In fact, Cornwallis referred to his earthworks there as no better than, quote, an entrenched camp, end quote, and a, quote, post to protect the Navy, end quote, meaning that his primary reason for being there was so that the Royal Navy could resupply him or evacuate him if that became necessary. Now, before we start into still more details at a much more granular level, let's take a brief look at some of the main characters that I'll be referring to. You have, of course, heard about Washington before now, the commander of the Continental Army, and his 3 division commanders at Yorktown, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who had surrendered Charleston to the British the year before. That will be an important data point before long. Major General the Marquis de Lafayette, who had commanded the light division that had shouted Cornwallis around the countryside that John talked about last time. And finally, Major General Friedrich von Steuben, who was commanding troops and guarding supplies in the Charlottesville area during the events that John covered last week. Let's move over to the right-hand side of the slide take a look at the British chain of command, or some of the prominent ones in that chain of command. The theater commander, Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, in New York City at the time of these events. His second in command, Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis, who after the fall of Charleston assumed command of the British Southern Campaign and was now campaigning in Virginia. And finally, Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Graves, who commanded the British naval expedition that tried to fight its way into the bay in the Second Battle of the Capes. Again, more about that in a few minutes. And then finally of all, the two French commanders in the center of the slide, Lieutenant General Comte de Rochambeau, commanding the land component of the French army operating in the New York City area with Washington. The French had sent what they called the Expedition Particulière. That's about as good as my French ever gets. In the summer of 1780 to operate out of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island. And then at the bottom of the slide, Vice Admiral Comte de Grasse, who commanded the French fleet in the Caribbean. It sailed from France in the spring of 1781, operated in the Caribbean for a while, and eventually sailed up to North America, no farther north than the Chesapeake Bay. And that's what focuses all of our attention on Cornwallis and the Bay as we move along. This slide conveys a very complex series of events that I can really only hope to summarize. So let's start with some arrows at the bottom of the map. The red arrow entering the south edge of the map, roaming around in the bay a bit, and then heading up to New York City. That's the appearance of the bulk of the British Caribbean fleet, which with the whole of the French Caribbean fleet exited those waters in August of 1781, headed northward toward eventually the Chesapeake Bay. British vessels in the period were copper sheathed, and so they sailed more efficiently in the water, and the British took a more direct route. And so they arrived first under the command of Rear Admiral Samuel Hood about the 25th of August, looked around inside the bay, saw no French vessels, only saw that small squadron operating with Cornwallis under Captain Thomas Simons, and then sailed on to New York City to join with British naval forces there. The French, sailing by a more indirect route and a little less efficiently because their ships were not copper sheathed, at least the hulls were not, arrived on the 31st of August, saw no British vessels in the Chesapeake save the small ones by naval standards operating with Cornwallis, and stayed, dropped anchor in Lynnhaven Bay, which is just inside the mouth of the larger bay on the south shore near Cape Henry, and thus command of or control of the sea passed for a critical handful of weeks from the British to the French. Control of the sea had been a British strong point for, throughout the conflict. And now at a critical moment, they lost control of the sea to the French. At the same time that all these movement of naval forces was going on, the French army under Rochambeau had made its way to the New York City area to operate with Washington against New York City. Washington wanted to retake the city. It was the British base of operations in North America. He had lost it in 1776. And while all of that activity was going on, a message arrived from de Grasse indicating that he would not sail to New York. He would sail only to the Chesapeake. And therefore, Washington changed his mind in an instant about operating against New York City, and focused his and Rochambeau's attention, because Rochambeau served under him by direction of King Louis XVI of France, focused his and Rochambeau's attention on the 450-mile strategic redeployment from the New York City area all the way down to Williamsburg and Yorktown, that took about a month from the middle of August to the middle of September to the third week of September to accomplish. It was, as the slide indicates, a logistical masterpiece. And when Washington received that message, which had come through the French Navy, then through the French Army, to him on the 14th of August, he wrote in his diary, and I will read a portion of it to you, because this is another document that changes things. Washington writes on the 14th of August, "Matters have now come to a crisis and a decisive plan to be determined on. I was obliged from the shortness of Count de Grasse's promised stay on this coast, the apparent disinclination of their naval officers to force the harbor of New York, to give up all idea of attacking New York, and instead thereof, to remove the French troops and a detachment from the American army to the head of Elk, to be transported to Virginia for the purpose of cooperating with the force from the West Indies against the British troops in that state." So that pretty well summarizes the situation. In only a matter of a handful of days, the French and the Americans in the New York area were on their way to the head of Elk, which is at the waters at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, the north end of it. They feinted in the direction of New York on the way, pretty much freezing Cornwallis in place, passed through Philadelphia, and then began in early to mid-September to make their way down the bay, as the map shows there, over water and over land. They all closed. All of the French and the Americans closed on the Williamsburg area by about the third week of September, and had to wait for a little while till they could gather sufficient ground transportation to begin the overland march to Williamsburg. So that sets our conditions for the beginning of the siege itself. Now, I mentioned that I would cover the Second Battle of the Capes, which occurred from the 5th through the 13th of September, 1781. It is the battle by which the French maintained control of the sea and prevented the British from sailing into the bay and relieving Cornwallis. And before I get to the battle itself, I wanted to mention briefly one of the controversial points of the battle, which is, why did the British simply not sail into the bay and up the York River where the red arrow points there and relieve Cornwallis in place? Well, there's several reasons for it. One of which is that there was too much shoal water in and around the mouth of the bay in the period. You can see Cape Charles on the north end, Cape Henry on the south end, and all the areas outlined in blue here are shoal water, which means that at low tide you would run the risk of running aground with an ocean-going vessel in the period. Also notice that the amount of deep water around the mouth of the bay is pretty constricted. So in order to sail in, you would have to fight the French in these constricted waters and not run aground in order to make your way up to Yorktown. The British decided simply not to do that. That's an important precursor to the Battle of the Capes. So the British naval forces under Graves and Hood and another admiral by the last name of Drake sortied from New York right at the end of August, taking about the usual 5 days to sail down to the mouth of the bay, and appeared on the horizon on the morning of the 5th of September. They had the weather gauge, which is to say the wind was blowing from the north-northeast, so it favored them as opposed to the French. They decided, for the reasons I explained a moment ago, not to sail directly into the bay. And when the tide turned about noon, the French began to sail out of the bay in line of battle, as you see toward the middle of the map there. The British, in the meantime, or Graves in the meantime, wore his fleet. That's a way of sailing, which is to say that he reversed the direction of his fleet to bring it alongside the French so they could fight one another in a long line. Line ahead is what the formation is called in the period. And the fighting began about 4 o'clock in the evening and continued until about 6:30 in the evening, only about 2.5 hours, resulting in about 550 casualties, shooting up the van or the lead ships of both of the fleets, but otherwise not much damaging the rest of both fleets. Over the next several days, the fleet stayed relatively in contact with one another, and the weather gauge blew them about 60 miles down the coast till they were off the outer banks of North Carolina. The British had several ships much worse shot up than the French did. They eventually had to scuttle and sink the HMS Terrible, which was a ship of the line or a capital ship or to use a more modern term, a battleship of the period. And on the 9th of September, de Grasse turned about and sailed back into the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and dropped anchor again in Lynnhaven Bay, thus maintaining control of the sea. Graves, by contrast, met with his subordinate admirals several times over the days that the fleets were near one another, and reached no decision. At least before de Grasse had decided to sail back to the mouth of the bay. Eventually, Graves turned about, sailed back to the mouth of the bay, found the French there at anchor in Lynnhaven Bay, and sailed off to New York to repair and refit his fleet. And once again, Cornwallis was cut off from resupply or reinforcement. This is a critical component of the siege of Yorktown. Without this French victory at sea, there would have been no siege of Yorktown. This slide conveys a couple of important points before we move on. You can see on the map the long arrow starting in Narragansett Bay and ending up in the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. That's the French fleet under the Comte de Barras, who had been operating with Rochambeau, that sailed about the end of August, way out to sea to try to avoid detection by the Royal Navy. And on the 10th of September, as de Grasse and Graves were down off the outer banks of North Carolina, de Barras sailed into the bay uncontested and began to offload a small reinforcement of troops, the French siege artillery, which is represented there on the right middle of the slide, and some supplies, to join with the 3,200 French troops that de Grasse had brought from the Caribbean, all to join with Lafayette, who had remained in the area after Cornwallis had crossed over the James, and to review, Washington and Rochambeau were in the process of making their way down to Williamsburg and Yorktown as well. So the world was collapsing around Cornwallis in the first half of September, to be sure. And to use a more modern term, the British had lost control of the maritime domain, which is the way we phrase it in modern military doctrine. Let's take a brief look at the Franco-American, the Allied order of battle before we get into the siege itself. I mentioned earlier that Rochambeau served under Washington by direction of Louis XVI. And so Rochambeau commanded the French wing, again, a combined arms force composed of artillery, a mounted unit under the Duc de Luçon, and 3 infantry brigades composed of 2 infantry regiments each. And then there was a separate 7th Unbrigaded Regiment as well. The American wing shows there under Washington's command, probably would have been more accurate to list it under Lincoln's command. That was, it was under his day-to-day command as Washington directed the whole of both armies. And it's also a combined arms formation with an artillery contingent, a mounted contingent under Colonel Stephen Moylan, 3 infantry brigades that I mentioned earlier under Lafayette, Lincoln, and von Steuben, and then a sizable body of Virginia militia, about 4,500 strong, under Brigadier General Thomas Nelson Jr., who also by this time was the governor of Virginia. So Cornwallis is going to be pretty significantly outnumbered. The total for the Allied Army there is shown as 16,000, probably more accurately at 20,000. And at the operational level, again, he was outnumbered 5-1. So this is a pretty desperate situation taking shape for Cornwallis. The French and the Americans were ready to advance from Williamsburg over to Yorktown by the last couple of 3 days of the month. They did so over the roads connecting the 2 towns, and they encountered the British in that line of redoubts stretching across the dry ground interval between the headwaters of those 2 creeks I mentioned earlier on the 28th and 29th of September. At that point, most of Cornwallis's army was actually not in the inner defensive line. It was outside those works, prepared to fight the French and the Americans in the open field. But on the evening of the 29th of September, Cornwallis received a letter from Clinton. That's another one of these documents that changes things. Clinton promised Cornwallis that a relief expedition would sail from New York about the 5th of October. One did eventually sail, but about 2 weeks later, on the same day that Cornwallis surrendered, on the 19th of October. But Cornwallis, of course, didn't know that on the 29th of September. And he responded the same evening to Clinton in a short letter that I'll mention because this is another document that changes things. Clinton, or Cornwallis rather, writes to Clinton, "Sir, I have ventured these last 2 days to look General Washington's whole force in the face in the position on the outside of my works. And I have the pleasure to assure your excellency that there was but one wish throughout the whole army, which was that the enemy would advance. I have this evening received your letter of the 24th, which has given me the greatest satisfaction. I shall retire this night within my works and have no doubt, if relief arrives in any reasonable time, York and Gloucester will be both in possession of His Majesty's troops." So for that reason, as a result of the letter that Cornwallis received from Clinton, he withdrew from the outer line of redoubts without a fight into the inner defense line, to the astonishment of the French and the Americans. This map shows you the camp areas of the French on the left, the Americans on the right, after the British had withdrawn from that dry ground interval between the headwaters of the two creeks that I mentioned earlier. This also brings up a point of protocol, also by direction of King Louis XVI. The French were auxiliary forces to the Americans, and therefore the post of honor on the right went to the Americans everywhere. Thus, the American camps are on the right and the French camps are on the left. And once the siege unfolds, the Americans will always be on the right and the French always on the left. And those camps were grouped around the headwaters of the Warwick River so that the animals, the horses and the oxen that both armies used could be easily watered. And it's well removed from the danger of the siege itself once it begins. Those camp areas are about a mile or more away from Yorktown itself. You can also see on this map across the York River to Gloucester Point, where the British had dug in as well. Their garrison over there was only about 1,000 strong of the roughly 9,000 to 10,000 total under Cornwallis's command. And all of the British mounted units were over there as well, so that they would have access to the countryside and could forage more easily there. One of those forage expeditions was underway on the morning of the 3rd of October, and it brought on what we call the Battle of the Hook, when the French and American contingent over there under the French Brigadier General de Choisy was moving down to the Gloucester Point area to lay siege to that fortified position as well. And as a result of the Battle of the Hook, the British, the Germans, and the Loyalists on both sides of the river were now completely surrounded and cut off from all resupply and reinforcement. And now the siege itself is about to begin. Before we get into those details, I want to pause for just a moment and consider what we would call the doctrine and mechanics of siege warfare. They didn't use the word doctrine in the same way that we do, but it's important to know the rules and the routines of siege warfare in the period. Look at the diagram at the upper right portion of the slide. That's one that I drew, and it gives you overall the process of a siege in the period. There is the position in the center, the besieged city or fortification or whatever the location is, and then two lines circling everything. Those are lines of circumvallation and contravallation. You don't have to remember the words, just know that those are combinations of terrain, water, and the enemy's forces that cut off all of the lines of communication, sustaining the place that's about to be besieged. And then the besieging army then over can be a several week, even several month period, digs a series of 3 parallels, starting at about 600 to 800 yards, having that distance at 300 to 400 yards, and then more than having that distance at under 100 yards, and sapping their way forward through those zigzag lines there, sometimes called communication trenches, moving siege caliber artillery, all the while ever closer to the besieged location and its defenders. And from the third parallel, the besieging army would focus its artillery fire on one portion of the fortifications of the enemy, open what's called a practicable breach, and if the siege goes all the way, conduct a general assault into the besieged location and put the garrison to the bayonet. So that is overall and quickly summarized the process of a siege. The illustration in the lower left just gives you a little more detail for the parallels, and then the illustration at the lower right shows you the three types of artillery used in siege warfare in the period. Those would be guns, howitzers, and mortars. The combination of the three knocks down the enemy's fortifications and wounds or kills his defenders and dismounts his artillery. So it's pretty well calculated to cause great destruction and injury on the inside of the besieged location. Once the siege is underway, there's a whole bunch of decisions to make, and I won't linger on these long. We have this vision of siege warfare as being slow and leisurely and can take forever. Well, in some cases that's true, but in this case, Washington only had about 3 weeks to work with. De Grasse had initially indicated that he could stay only as long as the 15th of October. When Washington reached Williamsburg, he went right away out to de Grasse's flagship and negotiated with de Grasse an extension to the end of October for the French fleet to stay on station. Because the moment the French sailed over the horizon is the moment the British would regain control of the sea and doubtless send a relief expedition in to, at a minimum, resupply and reinforce Cornwallis, if not evacuate him altogether. So Cornwallis's first dilemma was, whether to defend or attack or run away, and he chose to withdraw and defend, primarily on the basis of that letter that he received from Clinton on the 29th of September. Washington then had to decide whether to attack right away before Cornwallis could fully set his defense. And because he had an additional couple of weeks to work with, he decided on a formal siege. And then Cornwallis had to decide what to do in the face of that, whether to try to break out or whether to wait on relief. And he chose the latter, and that turned out not to be the wisest course of action, though I don't think any of those courses of action, sorties, mining, external relief efforts would have worked in the conditions that existed at the time. The siege proper began on the 6th of October with the opening of the first Allied parallel. Notice that in the length of the parallel, about 2/3 of a mile long, the Americans in blue, the blue line here, occupy the post of honor on the right. The French occupy the left, and that's, as I said earlier, is the case for all the protocol that follows in the siege. They began to dig the first parallel on the evening of the 6th of October. Most of the digging was done at night. And in the days leading up to the opening of the first parallel, the French and the Americans had constructed a whole bunch of implements that go by various French names, because the French had codified siege doctrine early in the 1700s, such things as gabions, fascines, abattis, etc., that would be used in the construction of the parallels, the redoubts, and the batteries that make them up. Finally, on the 9th of October, the firing associated with the siege, the bombardment began in the evening of that day. The French fired first from the opposite side of Yorktown in an area today that we call the French Trench at 3 in the afternoon, and the Americans fired from the first American Grand Battery on the far right of the Allied first parallel at 5 in the evening. And George Washington ceremonially fired the first American round. And you see the words there of Dr. James Thatcher, a Continental Army surgeon, recorded in his memoirs. His Excellency George Washington put the match to the first American gun, in a furious discharge of cannon and mortars immediately followed, and Earl Cornwallis has received his first salutation. Well, there would be plenty more salutations. By the time the siege ended about a week and a half later, the French and the Americans had fired a total of about 15,500 siege caliber rounds into the posts at Yorktown and Gloucester Point. Indeed, as one German corporal recorded the moment on the 17th of October, and we'll come to those details in a moment, the sky was literally filled with cannonballs at various times. And you see there in the painting at the bottom of the slide, how open the countryside was at the time, and the siege in full swing, with all kinds of firing going on from multiple locations at once. The siege continued through the 11th and the 12th of October, when the French and the Americans had sapped their way forward to the area where the second parallel would be constructed. But they could not finish the second parallel at about 300 to 400 yards range from the British inner defense line, because of those two redoubts that I mentioned earlier, guarding the left flank of the British inner line. Redoubts 9 with a garrison of about 120, and redoubt 10 with a garrison of about 70. They're on high ground, and the French and the Americans had to take them in order to complete the second parallel. So on the evening of the 14th of October, at about 8 p.m., the Allies fired 6 signal guns from the first parallel, and 2 elite infantry columns went forward simultaneously. The French on the left, the column there was composed of chasseurs and grenadiers, 2 forms of elite French infantry. The American column on the right was composed of 400 light infantrymen drawn from that light infantry division under Lafayette's command that had shadowed Cornwallis around the countryside that John talked about last week. That column, interestingly, was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, one day to be first Secretary of the Treasury in the first Washington administration. But on this night, he was a light infantry commander. He was an artillery officer by trade, but on this night, he was a light infantry commander at the head of the assault on British Redoubt 10. I'll deal with the French assault first because it was frankly the least successful. No insult meant there to our great French allies. It took the French about 30 minutes to overrun and capture Redoubt 9. They had to contend with a larger defending garrison, and they also got hung up in the line of abattis. That's the circle around both of the redoubts. Abattis is composed of the branches of trees, with the branches made sharp and the branches then all laced together and stuck in the ground. It's kind of like a line of concertina wire these days. The French got hung up in the abattis, got into a firefight with the British, and eventually fought their way in and captured the redoubt in half an hour's time at 25% casualties, right around 100. The Americans, by contrast, went forward with bayonets fixed, weapons unloaded as a fire discipline measure, among other considerations, and they overran British Redoubt 10 in about 10 minutes. And if you look at the arrows there, I think that the skill demonstrated by the Americans in the assault is remarkable. In effect, these 2 arrows are a fixing element, while this arrow here, this is Lieutenant Colonel John Lauren's battalion, really only about 70 to 80 men under arms, executed an envelopment and attacked British Redoubt 10 from the rear. So the Americans overran it in about 10 minutes. And then over the night, from the 14th to the 15th, the French and the Americans completed the second parallel all the way to the bluffs overlooking the York River, so that by the time the sun came up the next morning, the second parallel was in place, and the Americans and the French, especially the Americans, were moving large caliber artillery forward to continue the bombardment. And those 2 illustrations on the right just give you an idea of what kind of eyeball to eyeball with sharp objects fighting the assaults on redoubts 9 and 10 were. On the evening of the 16th of October, Cornwallis tried twice to break out or escape. If you look at the center of the map, you see a couple of arrows, one headed south and one headed back north. That's an infantry sortie that Cornwallis directed at about 4 in the morning on on the morning of the 16th of October, about 350 to 400 infantrymen who attacked the command and control seam, if you can see my cursor, between the French and the American sectors of the Allied second parallel. It was really more a pro forma attack. This is something the defender is supposed to do, try to break out. The British spiked a handful of artillery pieces. The French drove them off with an infantry counterattack, and the artillery pieces, because of the clumsiness with which they were disabled, were back in operation in a handful of hours. And the photograph at the top right of the slide shows the direction across open ground that the assault covered. Over the night of the 16th to the 17th of October, Cornwallis did indeed try to get away, to flee. He started the process of sending most of his army by boat across the York River to the Gloucester side of the river, massing it there and breaking out through the less numerous French and Americans on the north bank of the river. And the photo at the lower right-hand corner of the slide shows the direction of that movement. That is where the river narrows to about half a mile, spanned these days by the Coleman Bridge, and the direction of that movement toward the north bank. During the night, a severe rain squall blew in from the west to the east and thoroughly spoiled Cornwallis's attempt to escape, and as well broke his will to resist. So by the time the sun came up on the 17th of October, not only had Cornwallis pretty much decided to surrender, but the Allies were raining down cannonballs on the Germans, the British, and the loyalist Americans like they had not done any time before. About 10 that morning on the 17th of October, a British officer waving a white handkerchief and a British drummer indicated through beating parley on the drum and waving the handkerchief. These are all signals in the period for asking for parley, which is to ask for discussion, to negotiate articles of capitulation so that the British could surrender to the French and the Americans. And this initiates about a 48-hour period of back and forth correspondence between Washington and Cornwallis, eventually resulting in the meeting of 4 officers listed there in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. Lieutenant Colonel John Lawrence, the American representative, Louis the Viscount de Noailles, the French representative, and then Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dundas and Major Alexander Ross, the British representatives, meeting at the Moore House about a mile behind the Allied first parallel in the rooms circled there by the blue, and hammering out the 14 articles of capitulation by which Cornwallis would surrender. None more controversial than number 3, which contains this sentence enclosed in the black lines there: colors cased and drums beating a British or German march, which means that the British, the Germans, and the Loyalists would be denied the full honors of war. In the period, if you were withstanding a siege and forced to surrender, you would, in most cases, be afforded the full honors of war, which means you march out to surrender with your colors flying and playing the music of the besieging force as a nod to their professionalism and skill. But it was Washington's decision not to give the British the full honors of war because they had denied the full honors of war to the Americans the year before at Charleston. And Washington was determined to see that insult now corrected. On the 19th of October, the surrender itself took place. By the timeline that you can see there, starting at 11 in the morning and continuing until 3 in the afternoon, with the signing of the articles and then the surrender of various portions of both fortifications on both sides of the river, and then the garrisons themselves surrendering. The British on the Yorktown side surrendered first. They probably marched out sometime between 2 and 3 p.m., but Cornwallis was not among them. He feigned illness, said that he would not participate without the full honors of war, and so his second in command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, led the British, the Germans, and the Loyalists out, escorted by a French officer. And O'Hara was determined because he could easily tell the difference between the French and the Americans. The Americans were on the right or the east of the old Yorkhampton Highway, just outside the second parallel, the French to the left or to the west. He tried to surrender. O'Hara did. Cornwallis' sword, that is, to Rochambeau. Rochambeau would have none of it. He was serving under Washington. O'Hara tried to then surrender to Washington, who would have none of it, and directed O'Hara, Cornwallis's second in command, to Washington's second in command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, who, oh, by the way, had surrendered Charleston the year before without the full honors of war. So what the two illustrations at the bottom of the slide portray are the process of the Yorktown garrison marching out to what we call surrender field to lay down their arms, and then the one on the right there, the laying down of the arms itself or themselves. Why what do the Americans so treat the British at Yorktown? Not only was there the insult of Charleston the year before, but also as far as the Americans were concerned, and this is my reading of the primary evidence, the sources from the period. Lincoln had resisted to a third parallel the year before asking for parley. Cornwallis asked for parley only at the point of the completion of the second parallel, with only a third parallel, a practicable breach, and a general assault lying ahead. So there was really nothing but death and destruction lying ahead. But as far as the Americans were concerned, I have concluded they believed the British gave up too soon. And so they were not going to accord them the full honors of war for that reason as well. So once word of the disaster at Yorktown arrived in Great Britain, it initiated the sequence of events that led ultimately to the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that gave the United States its full independence. And in the meantime, the British and the Germans and the Loyalists there at Yorktown went into captivity as prisoners of war. Some portion of the Continental Army serving under Washington went to the Carolinas to reinforce Greene. Most of the Continental Army went back up to New York to resume its observation of the British in New York City. And the French stayed in the area in the Tidewater area until the summer of 1782 before marching back to the New York City area. The town the siege had thoroughly wrecked the town. It really never physically recovered. You can see one of the houses here. This is Secretary Nelson's house, full of holes looking like a piece of Swiss cheese. Eventually, the battlefield came under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service in the 1930s, and through archaeological study since then, the Allied lines in particular have been restored, and artillery has been placed in them, so you can study the events today. The earthworks around the town itself that the British constructed were never torn down, and the Confederates used them in 1861 and 62 as part of their defense of the Lower Peninsula in the American Civil War. And the monument there you see in the center is the Yorktown Victory Monument, which the Continental Congress authorized in a series of resolutions even before the end of October 1781, but the construction didn't begin until 1881 and took until 1884 to complete. But anyway, that's one of the prominent locations in the town where lots of ceremonies take place. And it's a location that we often visit when we conduct staff rides there for Army and other groups for leader development and professional development purposes. So, summarize pretty quickly, those are my thoughts on the conclusion of the Virginia campaign of 1781 and the siege of the same year. I'll turn the mic back over to the Namusa, and we'll field questions.
Britt, thanks very much. I know there was a lot of material to get to in just under an hour, and you did a great job with it. I got a couple of questions here, actually, if we could. First one, do you know if the 1st Rhode Island Regiment took part in securing Redoubt number 10?
Oh, do I ever? Yes. By then it was the Rhode Island Regiment. The 1st and 2nd had been combined into the Rhode Island Regiment. And yes, if I'd had time, I had way more material to use than I could possibly use. but I will show you something, though that is an account from Captain Stephen Olney, who commanded the light company of the Rhode Island regiment that was serving with the light division under Lafayette. And of the 3 battalions that fixed the British garrison at Redoubt 10, Gimat's battalion was in the lead, and Captain Olney's company was in the lead of Gimat's battalion, with only the Forlorn Hope and the sappers and miners ahead of them. So yes, did the Rhode Island Regiment participate in the capture of Redoubt 10? Yes, it did. The light company did.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question, what influence did Washington's decision to vaccinate his troops against smallpox have on the campaign?
I think potentially a large influence. I don't claim to know it in great detail, but one of the considerations that Washington was working his way through was, if he went south, would he go south to Tidewater, Virginia, or all the way to Charleston, South Carolina? And the Northern Continental Army was composed largely of New Englanders who not only didn't want to go to Virginia, they surely didn't want to go to the area of Charleston, South Carolina, because of the prevalence of disease in those areas and the high mortality rates. So I suspect that that further securing the health of the Continental Army probably aided and abetted their campaigning in Virginia or any other place in the South as well.
Okay. Regarding Gloucester Point, did the Americans or French bring over any siege guns to bombard Gloucester Point, or did they do that from the south side of the York River?
No, they took heavy weapons, some over to the north, the north shore of the north bank of the river, to lay siege to the British over there as well. But the bulk of the siege caliber artillery for the French and the Americans was on the south side of the river, to be sure.
Okay. All right. One more. If the British had been successful in bringing their troops over the river to Gloucester instead of being dispersed by the storm, would they likely have been able to escape the siege given the number of French and American troops on the point?
I think had the rain squall not spoiled everything, and the British have tried to break out, I think they would have succeeded in breaking out. But as I think I mentioned, there was a 450-mile overland trek through the enemy's country lying next ahead for them to make their way back up to New York and the safety of the British garrison there. Even if they had broken out, I just don't think that they would have been successful in marching those 450 miles.
All right, Dr. Britt McCarley, TRADOC Chief Historian and historian of the Yorktown campaign. Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate not only your hour today, but the enormous amount of time that you spent putting together the presentation, doing the research, talking with me and our other folks at the National Museum. Thanks very much.